They scrubbed her testimony from the records 3 times. The official investigation into what happened on Cold Hollow Mountain in November 1876 concluded with a single-page report. The witness statements that were taken, transcribed in careful longhand by a county clerk named Benjamin Marsh, were removed from the courthouse files sometime before 1881. What remains is a property deed transfer, a death certificate with the cause listed simply as exposure, and a single photograph that shouldn't exist. Because the woman in that photograph, standing rigid outside the Watauga County Courthouse in early 1877, her eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's frame, was supposed to have died on that mountain. According to every record, every newspaper account, every piece of documentation that survived the systematic purge of this story, Sarah Cunningham never made it off Cold Hollow Mountain alive. But she did make it down, and what she brought back with her was worse than death. You need to understand what the Appalachian wilderness was in 1876. Not the hiking trails and scenic overlooks and weekend camping destinations of today, but a frontier that had remained largely unchanged since the mountains first rose from ancient seabeds. The forests were old growth, trees that had witnessed centuries, their canopies so dense that sunlight became theoretical at ground level. The hollows between ridges held darkness like a physical substance, and the people who lived in those mountains, the ones who'd been there for generations, they had rules. Unwritten, unquestioned rules about where you went and where you didn't go. About which hollows were safe for hunting, and which ones you avoided even if it meant your family went hungry that winter. Cold Hollow was one of the places you didn't go. Sarah Cunningham was 23 years old in November 1876, unmarried, living with her sister's family in a settlement that would eventually be called Vilas, but was then just a collection of cabins scattered along Cove Creek. She worked as a school teacher, one of the few in the region who could read and write with any fluency, and she kept a journal. That journal, or what remains of it, is currently held in a private collection. The owner won't let it be photographed, won't let it be studied. But certain pages have been transcribed over the years, passed from researcher to researcher, and what Sarah wrote in the weeks before the expedition tells you something important about her mindset. November 3, 1876. Margaret says, "I am too curious for my own good. That curiosity in a woman is a form of vanity. Perhaps she's right. But I cannot help wondering about the stories, about whether there is truth beneath the superstition. The old women speak of Cold Hollow as if it were a living thing, as if the mountain itself has intentions. I am not a superstitious person. I believe in God and reason and the evidence of my own senses, but I confess I wonder what it is they fear so deeply." 3 weeks later, she would find out. The expedition was Margaret Preston's idea. Margaret was 31, the wife of a timber surveyor who spent most of his time in Boone, conducting business that Margaret understood was largely conducted in saloons. She had money, education, and a restlessness that her husband's frequent absences did nothing to satisfy. She'd come from Richmond 5 years earlier, and she never quite adapted to mountain life. She found it stifling, backward, suffocating in its adherence to traditions she considered primitive. When she proposed the hiking expedition to Cold Hollow, she framed it as a matter of rational inquiry. They would explore the hollow, document what they found, and prove once and for all that the local superstitions were nothing more than ignorance and fear of the unknown. The third woman was Emily Sutton, and her inclusion in the group should have been the first warning that something was wrong. Emily was barely 19, married for less than a year to a man named Jacob Sutton, who worked timber in the lower valleys. She was pregnant, 3 months along, though she hadn't told anyone yet except her husband. Why she agreed to join the expedition is a question that haunts what few records remain. Her family would later claim she was coerced, that Margaret Preston had some hold over her, some debt that needed repaying. Others suggested that Emily was running from something, that the pregnancy was not her husband's, that she saw the mountain as an escape rather than a danger. Whatever the truth, Emily Sutton followed Margaret Preston and Sarah Cunningham up the trail to Cold Hollow on November 24, 1876, and only one of them ever spoke about what happened next. They departed at dawn. Sarah's journal entry from that morning is brief, almost perfunctory. The weather is cold but clear. Margaret is in high spirits. Emily seems anxious, but Margaret assures her the route is well planned and we will return before nightfall. I have packed provisions, writing materials, and my father's compass. I confess to a certain excitement, though I am careful not to show it in front of Margaret, who would surely mock me for it. They never returned before nightfall. They never returned at all. Not together, not whole. Not as the women who'd set out that morning with surveying equipment and sandwiches wrapped in cloth. The search party found Sarah 6 days later. She was 12 miles from where the expedition had been headed, on the wrong side of the mountain entirely, in a ravine that the locals called Devil's Cradle. She was unconscious, suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, her hands torn and bloodied, her clothes shredded. She'd lost her shoes. Her feet were black with frostbite, and clutched in her right hand, so tightly that they had to pry her fingers open, was a leather cord threaded through 7 human teeth. The teeth were small, a child's teeth. But they were old, ancient even, the ivory yellowed and cracked. They'd been drilled through with holes that showed tool marks consistent with primitive methods. Native American, the doctor who examined them suggested. Cherokee, probably. Could have been 100 years old, could have been 500. But that wasn't what disturbed the men who found her. What disturbed them was that the cord was wet, freshly wet, and the teeth showed signs of recent handling. Someone had been wearing this necklace recently. Sarah remained unconscious for 2 days. When she woke, she screamed for 14 hours straight. The doctor, a man named Eli Braxton, who practiced medicine in the region for 40 years and delivered half the children born between 1860 and 1900, wrote a letter to a colleague in Raleigh describing Sarah's condition. That letter survived because it was kept in personal correspondence rather than official records. I have seen men come back from the war broken in ways that had nothing to do with their bodies, Braxton wrote. I have seen women lose their minds to grief and fever, but I have never seen a patient as I saw Miss Cunningham in those first days. She was not mad. She was terrified. There is a difference. Madness is internal, a corruption of thought and reason. Terror is a response to something external, something real. She was not seeing phantoms. She was remembering them. When Sarah could finally speak, she asked for her journal. They brought it to her, the journal she'd been keeping, and she spent an hour writing in it before anyone tried to question her. What she wrote during that hour was later torn from the journal. Those pages are gone. But the deputy who was present, a man named Thomas Wyatt, described Sarah's behavior to his wife, and his wife mentioned it in her own diary, which was preserved through family inheritance and eventually donated to a historical society. Thomas says she wrote like a woman possessed, never lifting the pencil, never pausing. He says her hand shook so badly he wondered how she could form letters at all. And when she finished, she closed the journal and said, "They're still up there. They're waiting." The official questioning began on December 2nd, 1876. Sarah Cunningham, still weak, still recovering from severe injuries, was brought before a magistrate named Harrison Cole. 3 deputies were present. A stenographer recorded everything. The transcripts of that interview existed until at least 1880, because a newspaper article published in the Watauga Democrat that year referenced specific details from Sarah's testimony. But the transcripts themselves are gone now, removed from the files along with every other piece of documentation that might have told the complete story. What we know comes from fragments, from newspaper articles that summarized without quoting directly, from letters and diaries kept by people adjacent to the investigation. From the testimony Sarah gave in unofficial settings to people she trusted in the months before she disappeared entirely from public record. She said they'd reached Cold Hollow by mid-morning. The route Margaret had planned took them along an old Cherokee trail that wound through thick forest, following the creek bed for 3 miles before ascending sharply into the hollow itself. The trees were massive, ancient oaks and chestnuts that blocked out the sky. Sarah described the silence as oppressive, total, as if the forest had absorbed all sound. No birds, no insects, nothing but their footsteps and their breathing and the occasional snap of a branch beneath their boots. Emily wanted to turn back. She'd felt it first, that sense of wrongness that every person who's ever entered a place they shouldn't be understands instantly. The feeling that you're trespassing, that you're being watched, that the environment itself wants you gone. But Margaret insisted they continue. Margaret, who'd planned this expedition for weeks, who'd studied maps and consulted with surveyors, who'd made this trip about more than exploration, about proving something, about being right, when everyone else was wrong. They found the first marker around noon. It was a cairn, a stack of rocks arranged with clear intentionality, surrounded by a circle of stones that had been placed to form a deliberate pattern. Symbols had been carved into several of the rocks, shapes that might have been Cherokee but weren't quite, designs that suggested meaning without clearly conveying it. Sarah had seen Cherokee writing before, had met several Cherokee people who still lived in the mountains, and she said these markings were different. Older, she thought, or newer, or something that had evolved separately from any tradition she recognized. Margaret was delighted. This was exactly what she'd hoped to find. Evidence of Native American settlement, artifacts that could be documented and studied. She spent half an hour making sketches of the cairn, measuring distances, taking notes. Sarah helped her, though she noticed something that made her uneasy. The stones in the circle were wet. Not damp from morning dew, but actively wet, as if they'd been recently submerged in water. But there was no water source nearby. The creek was half a mile back down the mountain. Emily wouldn't approach the cairn. She stayed at the edge of the clearing, her hand pressed to her stomach in a gesture that Sarah recognized, though she said nothing about it. Emily kept looking back down the trail, as if measuring the distance they'd come, calculating whether she could make it back alone if she had to. The second marker appeared a mile later, and this one stopped even Margaret. It was a tree, a massive oak that must have been 300 years old, and someone had carved into its trunk. Not symbols this time. Faces. Dozens of them, carved at various heights, covering the entire visible circumference of the tree. Human faces. But wrong. The proportions were distorted, the features too sharp or too soft, the eyes too large or placed too far apart. Some of the faces seemed to be screaming, others were laughing, and all of them, every single one, had been carved with their mouths open. Sarah described standing in front of that tree and feeling something she'd never felt before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of deep cellular understanding that she was looking at something profoundly transgressive, that whoever had carved these faces had been trying to accomplish something specific, something ritualistic, and that the purpose of the carving was not artistic or commemorative, but functional. These faces were meant to do something. Margaret wanted to document it. She set up her equipment, preparing to make detailed sketches. But when she looked up at the tree, she couldn't focus. The faces seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, seemed to change position or expression. She blamed it on the light filtering through the canopy, on exhaustion, on her eyes adjusting to the dimness. But Sarah noticed that Margaret's hands were shaking when she finally put her sketchbook away and said they should move on. Emily was crying. She stood 30 feet from the tree, her back turned to it, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs. When Sarah approached her, Emily grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises and whispered, "They're in the tree. Can't you hear them? They're in the tree." Sarah heard nothing but wind in the branches, but Emily's terror was so genuine, so absolute, that Sarah found herself listening harder, straining to hear whatever it was that Emily heard. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, she thought she did hear something, a sound like breathing. Like multiple people breathing in unison. Coming from inside the tree trunk, Margaret insisted they were being foolish. She invoked science, rationality, the importance of intellectual courage in the face of primitive superstition. She reminded them that they'd come here specifically to disprove the local fears, to demonstrate that Cold Hollow was nothing more than a geographic location, that the stories were just stories. And she started walking deeper into the hollow, not waiting to see if they would follow. They followed. Because in those situations, in those moments when fear and social pressure collide, most people choose the familiar danger of disappointing authority over the abstract danger of unknown threat. Sarah and Emily followed Margaret deeper into Cold Hollow, even though every instinct they possessed was screaming at them to run. They reached the hollow's heart by mid-afternoon. The clearing was circular, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, surrounded by trees that grew so densely they formed an almost solid wall. The ground was covered in dead leaves, undisturbed, no sign of animal tracks or human passage. In the center of the clearing was a structure. Not a building exactly, but something that had once been a building and had since become something else. The remains of a cabin, Sarah thought at first. But as she got closer, she realized the structure was far older than any frontier cabin. The wood darkened to near blackness, the construction techniques unfamiliar. And it was sinking. The entire structure was sinking into the ground, or the ground was rising around it, so that only the roof and the upper portion of the walls remained visible. The door was open. Margaret approached it first. She'd gone very quiet, her earlier confidence giving way to a focused intensity that Sarah recognized as dangerous. Margaret was the kind of person who, once committed to a course of action, would follow it through regardless of consequence. She would enter that structure because she'd told everyone she would, because turning back now would mean admitting she'd been wrong to come here in the first place. Sarah tried to stop her. She grabbed Margaret's arm, tried to physically restrain her, but Margaret shook her off with surprising strength. "We came to document," Margaret said, "so we'll document." She went through the door, and she was inside for less than a minute before she started screaming. Sarah ran to the entrance. The interior was dark, darker than it should have been, given the open door and the cracks in the walls. She could see Margaret's silhouette, see her backing away from something deeper in the structure, her hands raised defensively. Sarah called to her, but Margaret didn't respond. She just kept backing up, kept making this sound, this high, breathless keening that barely sounded human. Then Margaret stopped moving. She stood perfectly still in the center of the structure, her arms at her sides, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. And she said, in a voice that was recognizably hers but somehow wrong in its rhythm and inflection, "Come inside, Sarah. Come see what I see." Sarah didn't go inside. Some instinct, some survival mechanism buried deep in her genetic memory, kept her frozen at the threshold. She could see Margaret clearly now. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and what she saw made her step back. Margaret's face was slack, empty, as if she'd been hollowed out and filled with something else. And behind Margaret, deeper in the structure, Sarah could see movement. Shapes that might have been human if you didn't look too closely. If you didn't notice that they moved wrong, that their proportions were distorted, that they seemed to glide rather than walk. Emily was the one who ran first. She bolted from the clearing, crashing through the underbrush, not following the trail, but simply fleeing in whatever direction promised escape. Sarah heard her screaming, heard the sounds of her passage growing fainter, and she knew she had seconds to make a decision. She chose to run. She left Margaret standing in that structure, left her to whatever had claimed her, and she ran. What happened next is where Sarah's testimony becomes fragmented, contradictory, impossible to verify. She described running through the forest for hours, losing the trail immediately, tearing through undergrowth that seemed to grow denser the farther she went. She described the sun setting with impossible speed, the light draining from the sky as if something was drinking it. She described hearing footsteps behind her, around her, footsteps that kept pace no matter how fast she ran. And she described finding Emily. Emily was in a ravine, wedged between two rocks, her legs trapped beneath a fallen log. She'd broken her ankle in the fall, and she was sobbing, begging Sarah to help her, to get her free. Sarah tried. She spent what felt like hours trying to move the log, trying to dig Emily out, but the log was massive, waterlogged, impossibly heavy. And while she worked, while she strained and pulled and accomplished nothing, Emily told her what she'd seen. Emily had looked back. She'd run from the clearing, but something made her look back, and she'd seen them coming out of the structure. Not Margaret. Margaret was gone, or transformed, or consumed. But the others, the ones who'd been waiting inside, they'd emerged into the clearing. Emily described them as people who'd been damaged and then reconstructed incorrectly. Their limbs were too long, their joints bent in too many places, their faces were stretched over skulls that weren't quite the right shape, and they moved with purpose, with direction, following the path Emily had taken, tracking her through the forest with the patient inevitability of something that had all the time in the world. Sarah was still trying to free Emily when she heard them approaching. The sounds of movement through the forest, the snap of branches, the rustle of leaves, but also something else. A sound like singing. Like multiple voices singing in harmony. But the melody was wrong, the notes didn't quite connect, and the words were in a language that predated language. Emily begged Sarah to run. She grabbed Sarah's arm, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Save the baby. Even if you can't save me, save the baby." Sarah didn't run. Not then. She stayed with Emily, crouched beside her, trying to think of something, anything that might help. And that's when she saw them enter the ravine. There were 7 of them. That detail appeared in every version of Sarah's testimony. Never varied. Never changed. 7 figures moving down the ravine wall with a fluidity that defied the terrain's difficulty. They were dressed in leather, she said, or something like leather, clothing that might have been hides but moved like fabric. And they wore masks. No, not masks. She corrected herself multiple times on this point. Not masks, but faces that weren't their original faces. Faces that had been taken from somewhere else and placed over whatever they truly were. The one in front was wearing Margaret's face. Not a mask made from Margaret's skin, though Sarah would later admit she couldn't be certain of that. But a face that was Margaret's in every detail, every line and freckle and individual hair, moving with Margaret's expressions, animated by Margaret's features. Except the eyes were wrong. The eyes were flat and dark and showed no recognition when they looked at Sarah. What happened in that ravine took either seconds or hours, depending on which version of Sarah's testimony you believe. Time became elastic, she said. The thing wearing Margaret's face spoke to her in Margaret's voice, said things that Margaret would say, used turns of phrase that were distinctly Margaret's. It told Sarah that she could join them, that they'd been waiting for new voices, new faces, new flesh to inhabit. It told her that Emily had already been chosen, that the child in Emily's womb made her particularly valuable. And it told her that Cold Hollow had always been a threshold, that the people who'd built the structure in the clearing had understood this, had used it, had found a way to persist beyond their natural span, by consuming those who came after. Sarah ran then. She left Emily in that ravine, left her screaming and begging and trapped, and she ran. She said she had no choice, that if she'd stayed she would have been consumed too, that her survival was the only way Emily's story could be told. But in the months after, the guilt of that abandonment ate at her like acid. She ran for 6 days, at least. She thought it was 6 days, though she lost track of time, couldn't be sure if she was experiencing linear time at all, or if the forest was playing with her perception, stretching hours into days, or compressing days into moments. She ate nothing, drank from streams when she found them. Her feet bled, her hands tore, and every time she stopped, every time she tried to rest, she heard them. The singing, getting closer. The necklace appeared around her neck sometime during the 2nd day of her flight. She didn't put it on. She swore to this repeatedly, insisted that she'd never even seen it before it was simply there. The leather cord tied around her throat, the teeth clicking together against her chest as she ran. She tried to remove it. Couldn't. The cord wouldn't tear, wouldn't untie, and when she tried to pull it over her head, it tightened, choking her until she stopped trying. The men who found her, the search party that had been combing the mountains for nearly a week, they found her in Devil's Cradle holding the necklace in her hand. The cord had broken, or she'd somehow gotten it off, but her grip on it was so tight they thought at first she'd died clutching it. One of the men later said that when they approached her, when they were still 50 feet away, they heard her talking, muttering to herself in a voice that wasn't quite her own, speaking words in a language none of them recognized. They brought her down the mountain. They treated her injuries, they questioned her, and then, systematically, methodically, someone began erasing her testimony from the record. The first stenographer's transcripts disappeared within a week of being filed. Deputy Wyatt's notes vanished from his personal files. Dr. Braxton's medical reports were removed from his office while he was attending a birth in the next county. The newspaper articles that were published became increasingly vague, referencing, quote, conflicting testimony and unreliable witness, and eventually just stopped mentioning the case at all. Sarah tried to tell her story anyway. She spoke to anyone who would listen, describing what she'd seen in Cold Hollow, warning people to stay away from the mountain. Most dismissed her as traumatized, driven mad by exposure and the loss of her companions. But some listened. Some heard the conviction in her voice, saw the scars on her hands and feet, and believed her. Those people tended to disappear, not dramatically, not with violence or obvious foul play. They simply left, moved away suddenly, stopped coming to town, were reported dead from natural causes. Within 6 months of the Cold Hollow incident, 14 people who'd had direct contact with Sarah Cunningham were gone, dead, moved, vanished. The local population began avoiding her, crossing the street when they saw her coming, refusing to speak to her or acknowledge her presence. Sarah's journal entries from this period, the ones that survived, show a woman descending into paranoia and isolation. But they also show incredible detail. She began documenting everything she could remember about Cold Hollow, about the structure in the clearing, about the things that had emerged from it. She drew sketches from memory, diagrams of the cairn and the tree with carved faces. She wrote down the words of the song she'd heard in the ravine, phonetically transcribing a language she didn't understand, and she started finding connections. There were stories she discovered, stories that went back generations, tales of people who'd gone missing in Cold Hollow over the years, disappearances that were always explained away as accidents, exposure, animal attacks. She found references in old land deeds to a Cherokee settlement that had once existed near the hollow, a settlement that was abandoned suddenly in the late 1700s with no explanation. She tracked down the descendants of families who'd lived in the area for centuries and listened to their whispered warnings about places in the mountains where reality was thin, where the boundary between worlds was permeable. She found 7 other necklaces. They were held in private collections, passed down through families, acquired through estate sales and property seizures. She never got her hands on the actual objects, but she documented their existence. 7 necklaces identical to the one found in her hand, each made from human teeth, threaded on leather cord, each associated with a disappearance in or around Cold Hollow. The oldest dated to 1793. The most recent, before Sarah's, was from 1854. A woman named Catherine Hale who'd gone hiking in the mountains with her 2 sisters. She'd returned alone. Told a story remarkably similar to Sarah's. And then she'd hanged herself 6 months later in her family's barn. Sarah was building a case. Not a legal case, but something larger. An argument for the existence of something inexplicable that dwelled in those mountains. She was gathering evidence that could prove her story, that could validate her experience, and warn others away from Cold Hollow. And then she encountered someone who already knew. His name was Jeremiah Cole, and he claimed to be related to Harrison Cole, the magistrate who'd first questioned Sarah. But there was no record of any relation, and Jeremiah himself seemed to exist in a gray area of documentation. He appeared in census records inconsistently. His property ownership was unclear. People knew him, but no one could quite remember how they knew him or how long he'd been around. Jeremiah met with Sarah in April 1877, 5 months after she'd come down from the mountain. They met in secret, in an abandoned church outside of Boone. And Jeremiah told her things that no one else had been willing to say. He told her that Cold Hollow was one of 7 places, young thresholds scattered throughout the Appalachian range, places where something old, something that preceded human settlement in North America, had established a foothold. He told her that these places operated on a cycle, that they needed to be fed periodically, and that the cycle's length varied but typically ran between 20 and 30 years. He told her that there were families in the mountains, bloodlines that went back centuries, who served as guardians of these thresholds. not protectors trying to seal them. Guardians who maintained them, who ensured they were fed when necessary, who preserved the knowledge of their existence and their requirements. He told her that Margaret Preston's expedition hadn't been Margaret's idea at all. The Preston family, Jeremiah explained, had been one of the Guardian families. Margaret's husband, Thomas Preston, came from a line that had served Cold Hollow for generations. And when the cycle indicated that the threshold needed feeding, when the signs appeared that the hollow was growing hungry, the Guardians would arrange for suitable offerings. They couldn't just disappear people themselves, not without drawing too much attention. But they could encourage certain individuals to visit the hollow, could plant ideas, suggest adventures, make it seem like the victim's own choice to walk into that darkness. Margaret had been chosen years before. Her restlessness, her education, her outsider status, all of it made her perfect. They'd let her plan the expedition herself, thinking it was her idea, her adventure. And they'd made sure she brought others with her. Because the threshold didn't just need bodies. It needed voices. It needed stories. It needed people who would carry the knowledge back, who would spread the tale, who would make others curious. Sarah herself had been part of the offering, not meant to die, but meant to survive, to bear witness, to tell the story and make others wonder about Cold Hollow, because curiosity was how the cycle perpetuated itself. Every telling of the story, every warning to stay away, only made more people want to see for themselves. Jeremiah gave Sarah a choice. She could continue investigating, continue trying to expose the truth, and she would die within the year. Not from the Guardians, though they would certainly be watching her, but from the threshold itself, because she carried part of it now. The necklace had marked her, even though she'd gotten free of it. She was connected to Cold Hollow in ways that would eventually pull her back, would compel her to return, would ensure that she walked up that trail and into that clearing and through that doorway of her own volition. Or she could leave, completely, not just the region, but the country. She could go somewhere the threshold couldn't reach, somewhere the cycle didn't extend, and she could never speak of it again, never write about it. Never try to warn anyone or investigate further. Complete silence in exchange for her life. The meeting was documented in a letter Sarah wrote to her sister, but never sent. That letter was found in Sarah's room after she disappeared, hidden in a Bible, pressed between the pages of Revelations. In it, Sarah describes Jeremiah's offer and her response. She refused. Sarah Cunningham spent the next 3 months in a fury of research and documentation. She traveled throughout western North Carolina, seeking out anyone who might have information about Cold Hollow or the other thresholds Jeremiah had mentioned. She compiled a manuscript, hundreds of pages detailing everything she'd learned, every story she'd collected, every piece of evidence she'd gathered. She intended to publish it, to make the information public in a way that couldn't be suppressed or erased. She disappeared on July 14, 1877, 8 months after coming down from Cold Hollow. Her landlord reported her missing when she didn't pay rent. Her room was searched. The manuscript was gone. Her journal was gone. Everything she'd gathered, all her research and documentation, had been removed. The only things that remained were personal effects, and that one unsent letter to her sister. A body matching Sarah's description was found 3 weeks later at the base of a cliff about 40 miles from Cold Hollow. The corpse was badly decomposed, identification was tentative, and the death was ruled accidental. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and that should have been the end of Sarah Cunningham's story. But the photograph exists. It was taken in January 1878, 6 months after Sarah's supposed death. A traveling photographer set up a studio in Boone for 3 weeks, taking portraits of local families. Among his collection, discovered years later when his personal effects were auctioned after his own death, was a single image that should be impossible. It shows a woman standing outside the Watauga County Courthouse. She's dressed in plain clothes, her hair pulled back severely, her posture rigid. She's staring directly at the camera with an expression of absolute terror. And she's Sarah Cunningham. The facial features match exactly. The scar on her left hand, visible in the photograph, matches descriptions from medical reports filed after her rescue. Even the dress she's wearing matches one that was documented in the inventory of her possessions after her disappearance. The photograph has been examined by multiple experts. It's authentic, not manipulated, genuinely from the period. The woman in the image is either Sarah Cunningham or her identical twin, and Sarah had no twin. Around her neck, clearly visible in the photograph, is a necklace made from human teeth strung on leather cord. The photographer who took the image, a man named Robert Dalton, left only one notation about the subject. Written on the back of the photograph in his handwriting. Subject refused to provide name, paid double fee for sitting, behavior erratic, left before photograph completed. That photograph is now held by the Appalachian Regional Historical Society. They don't display it. They don't publicize its existence. But if you request to see it, if you go through the proper channels and have legitimate research credentials, they'll bring it to you in a locked box. And they'll warn you before they open that box that some people who viewed the photograph report unusual experiences afterward. Dreams about mountains. Unexplained compulsions to visit Western North Carolina. A feeling of being watched. The investigation into what happened on Cold Hollow Mountain officially closed in 1879. Margaret Preston was declared dead, killed in a hiking accident. Emily Sutton was declared dead, same cause. Sarah Cunningham was declared dead, different incident but same general classification. The case was filed away. The records were largely destroyed or lost, and Cold Hollow returned to being just another place on the map that locals knew to avoid. But the disappearances didn't stop. Between 1877 and 1920, at least 30 people vanished in or around Cold Hollow. Most were hikers or hunters who ignored local warnings. Some were locals who should have known better. A few were researchers or thrill seekers who'd heard the stories and wanted to see the place for themselves. The pattern continued through the decades, regular enough to be noticeable if you were looking, but spaced out enough that each incident could be explained individually as simple misadventure. The cycle that Jeremiah Cole had described to Sarah, that 20 to 30-year pattern of feeding, appears consistently in the disappearance records if you know how to track it. Clusters of vanishing separated by periods of relative quiet. 1876 to 1878, major cluster. 1899 to 1902, another cluster. 1924 to 1926. 1948 to 1951. 1973 to 1976. And then, after 1976, something changed. The disappearances stopped. Completely. Cold Hollow became, for the first time in recorded history, genuinely safe. People hiked through it without incident. Researchers explored it thoroughly. The structure in the clearing, which several expeditions attempted to locate using descriptions from historical accounts, was never found. The trees with carved faces either didn't exist or had been removed. The cairns had been dismantled or never existed at all. It's as if Cold Hollow itself had closed, as if the threshold, whatever it was, had been sealed or abandoned or satisfied. There are theories, of course. The most generous interpretation suggests that the guardian family simply stopped maintaining the threshold, let it go dormant, allowed the cycle to end. The darker interpretation, the one whispered in academic circles by researchers who've spent too long studying Appalachian mysteries, suggests something else. That the threshold didn't close, it succeeded. That whatever had been using Cold Hollow as an entry point, whatever had been consuming people and wearing their faces and adding to its collection of voices, had finally accumulated enough, had gathered sufficient mass or power or presence to move beyond that single location, had spread. There's a database maintained by a private research group that tracks disappearances in the Appalachian region. It's not public, it's not official. But it exists, compiled by people who've made it their life's work to identify patterns in missing person cases. And according to that database, the pattern that defined Cold Hollow, those regular cycles of clustered disappearances, now appears in multiple locations throughout the Appalachian Range. Not 7 locations, as Jeremiah Cole suggested, but dozens, maybe hundreds. Small areas, usually remote, usually with limited population and inadequate law enforcement presence, where people vanish with disturbing regularity, where the disappearances follow that same 20 to 30-year cycle, where locals refuse to go, tell stories about places that are wrong, maintain traditions of avoidance that they can't fully explain but refuse to abandon. The database suggests that whatever was contained in Cold Hollow, whatever Sarah Cunningham encountered in 1876, has metastasized. That the threshold model wasn't about containment at all, but about propagation, that Cold Hollow was never a prison or a singular anomaly, but a seed. And now the forest is full of them. You can verify some of this yourself, if you're willing to look. The photograph of Sarah Cunningham is real, documented, accessible through formal channels. The disappearance records exist in county archives throughout western North Carolina, fragmented and scattered but traceable if you know what you're looking for. The oral histories collected by the WPA in the 1930s include dozens of references to places in the mountains where people don't go, places with rules that predate written memory. And there are the necklaces, 7 of them connected to Cold Hollow incidents. But the database has identified 43 similar objects associated with Appalachian disappearances. 43 necklaces made from human teeth, strung on leather cord, found clutched in the hands of sole survivors or discovered at vanishing sites. 43 markers of something that happened, something that was witnessed, something that was survived but never fully escaped. The teeth in these necklaces have been tested when possible. DNA analysis on 3 of them, conducted in the 1990s, produced results that the researchers refused to publish. The teeth were human, certainly, but the DNA showed anomalies, inconsistencies in the genetic markers that suggested either severe contamination or something the researchers described in private correspondence as, quote, biologically impossible. 2 of the researchers involved in that analysis left the field entirely within a year. The third committed suicide. Sarah Cunningham's necklace, the one found in her hand in Devil's Cradle, still exists. It's held in the same private collection that houses what remains of her journal. The owner, whose identity is protected by multiple layers of legal privacy, has allowed exactly 3 examinations of the object since acquiring it in 1982. Each examination was conducted under strict protocols, limited time exposure, extensive documentation required. All 3 researchers who examined the necklace reported the same phenomenon. The teeth, when observed under magnification, show internal structures that teeth shouldn't have. Hollow chambers connected by what appear to be vascular channels. Microscopic inscriptions on the inner surfaces, symbols that match no known writing system. And, most disturbingly, evidence of recent organic activity. The teeth aren't fossils, they're not inert objects. They're preserved in a state that suggests neither life nor death, but something held in suspension between the two. The current owner of Sarah's necklace keeps it in a lead-lined box, inside a safe, in a climate-controlled vault. This isn't about preservation, this is containment. Because the necklace, according to the owner's private notes, continues to exhibit behavior. The leather cord repairs itself when damaged. The teeth rearrange their order on the cord, forming different patterns. And on certain dates that correspond to the 20 to 30-year cycle, the necklace becomes warm to the touch and emanates a sound that recording equipment captures as ultrasonic vibration, but that human witnesses describe as singing. The guardian families that Jeremiah Cole mentioned to Sarah, if they ever truly existed as organized entities, have evolved or dispersed or been absorbed into the broader population. But there are families in the Appalachian region, multi-generational residents with roots going back to pre-colonial settlement, who maintain certain traditions, who tell their children about places to avoid, who pass down knowledge about signs and markers and behaviors that indicate danger, who keep private records, family journals, handed down through generations, documenting encounters and disappearances and the rules for survival. These families don't advertise their knowledge. They don't seek attention or validation. They live quietly, maintain their traditions, and watch. And occasionally, very occasionally, they intervene. When someone is planning to visit one of the threshold locations, when the cycle indicates that a feeding is approaching, when the signs suggest that the hunger is building, they'll try to warn people away. Not with stories about Sarah Cunningham or historical incidents, because those stories only create curiosity, but with practical concerns. Road conditions, property disputes, dangerous wildlife. Anything to redirect attention, to make the remote hollow or abandoned settlement or forgotten trail seem like more trouble than it's worth. Sometimes it works, most times it doesn't. Because humans are curious. Because we're drawn to the forbidden. Because when someone tells us not to go somewhere, we immediately want to know why, and that desire to know overrides our instinct for self-preservation. The database of disappearances shows a disturbing acceleration in recent decades. In the 1800s, the pattern was clear but limited. Perhaps 2 or 3 clusters per generation across the entire Appalachian range. By the 1900s, the frequency had increased. By the 2000s, the pattern appears in census data as statistically significant population anomalies. Small mountain communities that should have stable or growing populations instead show periodic, unexplained declines. Groups of people, usually young adults, who vanish within narrow time windows. Disappearances that cluster geographically and temporally in ways that random chance can't explain. The National Park Service has internal documentation, not available to the public, about certain areas within Appalachian parks and forests that experience higher than average disappearance rates. These areas are sometimes closed to the public, but the closures are attributed to environmental concerns, wildlife management, trail maintenance. The real reason, according to park rangers who've spoken anonymously to researchers, is that the rangers themselves won't go into these areas. They've seen things, found things, had experiences that convince them these places are genuinely dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with natural hazards. One ranger, interviewed in 2015 under condition of anonymity, described finding a clearing in the Pisgah National Forest that matched descriptions of the cold hollow structure. The building was there, sunk into the earth exactly as Sarah had described, the door open, the interior impossibly dark. The ranger, following protocol, called for backup before investigating, but when other rangers arrived 30 minutes later, the clearing was empty, no structure, no signs that anything had ever been there except disturbed earth, and the ranger's own footprints, stopping at what would have been the threshold. That ranger quit the Park Service a week later, moved to Arizona, refused to discuss the incident further. But their report exists in internal files, and it's not the only one. There are dozens of similar accounts from park personnel, Forest Service workers, search and rescue teams. Encounters with clearings that shouldn't exist. Structures that appear and vanish. Sounds of singing in empty wilderness. Missing persons cases where the search dogs refuse to follow the trail, where experienced trackers report feeling overwhelming compulsion to turn back. The search and rescue community has its own oral tradition about Appalachian disappearances. Stories shared in training sessions and after-operation debriefings, never written down, never formalized, but consistent across regions and decades. The missing 411 phenomenon, popularized in recent years by true crime documentaries, only scratches the surface of what the search and rescue community knows about mountain disappearances. The cases that get public attention are the simple ones, the straightforward vanishings where someone goes hiking and never comes back. The cases that stay internal, that get closed quietly, that the teams refuse to discuss, those are the ones that don't make sense, where people are found miles from where they should be, in locations that required technical climbing to reach, with no memory of how they got there. Where survivors come back speaking languages they never learned. Where the missing are found weeks later looking like they've aged years, or haven't aged at all. And then there are the cases where people come back wrong, where the person who went missing is found alive and returned to their family, but something fundamental has changed. They speak with different cadence. They hold their body differently. They don't quite remember personal details they should know. Family members report feeling uncomfortable around them, feeling like they're talking to an imitation of their loved one rather than the person themselves. These cases don't stay open long. The family usually stops complaining, stops asking questions, accepts the returned person as genuine. Or the family moves away. Or the returned person disappears again, this time permanently. There's a theory, proposed by a researcher who died in a hiking accident in the Smokies in 2003, that the threshold phenomenon isn't about consumption at all. It's about replacement. That whatever exists in these places isn't killing people, but swapping them. Taking someone from our reality and leaving something that looks like them but isn't. Something that can move freely in our world while the original person is trapped in whatever place exists on the other side of the threshold. The researcher, Dr. Patricia Vance, had compiled evidence suggesting that certain individuals who disappeared in Appalachian incidents later reappeared in different locations under different names, but with identical physical characteristics and similar biographical details. She was developing a database to track these potential duplicates when she died. Her death was ruled accidental. She fell from a ridge while hiking alone. But her research notes disappeared from her office before her family could claim them. The university where she worked claimed no knowledge of her mountain disappearance project, stated that her work focused on colonial settlement patterns. Her colleagues, when interviewed, gave contradictory accounts of her research interests. And the trail where she supposedly fell had been one she'd hiked dozens of times, a route she knew intimately, in conditions that were clear and safe. You start to see the pattern. Researchers who get too close to understanding what's happening in the mountains tend to have accidents. Or they stop researching. Or they change their focus entirely, suddenly interested in completely unrelated topics. Or they publish work that contradicts their previous findings, backing away from conclusions they'd seemed certain about. Or they simply disappear. The academic community studying Appalachian anomalies has lost 17 researchers in the past 40 years, 17 people who were actively investigating disappearance patterns, threshold theories, or the historical documentation of incidents like Cold Hollow. Some died in mountain accidents, some died in car crashes, some died from sudden illness. 3 were murdered in apparently random crimes, 2 committed suicide. 1 walked into a forest preserve in Tennessee and was never seen again. 17 deaths, distributed across 4 decades, wouldn't necessarily indicate a pattern. Researchers die. Accidents happen, but these 17 were all working on the same basic question. What is happening in the Appalachian Mountains that causes people to vanish in consistent patterns across centuries? And all 17 died or disappeared before publishing their comprehensive findings, though most had indicated they were close to some kind of breakthrough. Dr. Vance's computer was wiped clean after her death. The backup drives she kept in her office were gone, but she'd shared preliminary findings with a colleague via encrypted email 6 weeks before she died. That colleague, Dr. Martin Chen, preserved the correspondence and eventually leaked it to a small circle of researchers who continue the work in secret. What Vance had discovered was simple and terrifying. She'd identified 47 current locations in the Appalachian Range where disappearances followed the threshold pattern. She'd mapped them geographically and discovered they formed a network, connected by ley lines or magnetic anomalies or some other organizing principle she hadn't fully determined. And she'd found evidence that new thresholds were appearing, that the number 47 was increasing, that whatever was happening was accelerating rather than diminishing. Her final email to Chen contained a single sentence after the data summary. They're not portals to somewhere else. They're more like seeds that haven't finished germinating. What she meant by that, what she'd discovered that led to that conclusion, died with her. But other researchers have built on her foundation, working carefully, publishing nothing, sharing findings only within trusted networks. And the picture that's emerging is genuinely horrifying. The threshold theory suggests that something ancient, something that existed in North America before human settlement or perhaps before human evolution, established itself in specific locations where the barrier between realities was naturally thin. The Cherokee and other indigenous peoples who inhabited these mountains for thousands of years knew about these places, developed cultural practices to avoid them, to contain them, to prevent them from spreading. The guardian families that emerged in the post-colonial period inherited this knowledge, took on the responsibility of maintenance, of feeding the thresholds to keep them satisfied and localized. But at some point, deliberate or accidental, the containment strategy failed. Instead of keeping the thresholds isolated, the regular feeding actually strengthened them. Each person consumed, each face stolen, Each voice added to the collection increased the threshold's power and reach. The 20 to 30-year cycle wasn't about hunger. It was about reproduction. Each feeding event wasn't satiating the threshold, it was enabling it to butt off a new instance, to create another location where the barrier was thin enough to allow passage. Cold Hollow stopped having disappearances after 1976 not because it closed, but because it had finished. It had generated enough offspring, seeded enough new locations, that it no longer needed to be active. It could go dormant while its children matured and began their own cycles. If this theory is correct, and there's substantial evidence suggesting it might be, then the Appalachian Mountains are in the process of being colonized by something that views humans as resource and habitat. We're not prey exactly. We're more like the nutrient medium in which this entity grows. It needs us, but not in the way a predator needs food. In the way a virus needs cells to replicate. In the way a parasite needs a host to complete its life cycle. And it's not limited to the Appalachians anymore. Researchers tracking the pattern have identified potential threshold locations in the Rockies, the Cascades, the mountain ranges of Appalachia's sister regions in Europe and Asia. The phenomenon appears to be adapting, learning, spreading through some mechanism that exploits both geographic features and human behavior. Remote locations with low population density, where disappearances can occur without immediate investigation. Tourist destinations where transient visitors provide a steady supply of victims who won't be immediately missed. Wilderness areas where people expect to take risks, where accidents are plausible, where the strange and unexplained can be dismissed as natural hazard. The database now tracks over 300 potential threshold locations worldwide. 300 places where the disappearance pattern matches the Cold Hollow model, where people vanish in clusters, where survivors return wrong or marked, where the locals maintain traditions of avoidance, where something old and patient and hungry waits for the next feeding cycle. Sarah Cunningham tried to warn people. She spent 8 months gathering evidence, documenting her experience, building a case for the existence of something inexplicable and dangerous. She was silenced, erased from the record, buried in an unmarked grave, but her story survived. Fragments of it. Pieces that slipped through the suppression attempts and made their way into oral tradition, into family histories, into the collective memory of people who live in those mountains. And occasionally, someone finds those fragments and starts asking questions, starts researching, starts connecting Cold Hollow to similar incidents, starts building the same case that Sarah built, accumulating the same evidence, reaching the same conclusions. And then they have a choice: stop investigating and maybe survive, or continue and join the list of 17 researchers who asked too many questions about Appalachian disappearances. The photograph of Sarah Cunningham remains in that archive, her face frozen in terror, the necklace visible around her throat. A woman who should have been dead, standing in front of a courthouse 6 months after her supposed burial. Every researcher who studied the Cold Hollow incident has spent time with that photograph, staring at Sarah's expression, trying to understand what she's trying to communicate across more than a century of silence. Some claim they see words formed by her lips, captured in the instant the shutter clicked. The photograph's resolution isn't good enough to verify this, but multiple people, viewing the image independently, report seeing the same apparent word formation. 2 syllables. A warning or an identification or a name for what she encountered. The word they see is hollow. Not Cold Hollow specifically, just hollow. As if she's trying to tell us that what she found on that mountain, what took Margaret Preston and Emily Sutton and marked Sarah herself, is a hollowness. An emptiness that consumes and imitates and spreads. Avoid wearing human faces, speaking human words, moving through human spaces, always hungry for more voices to add to its collection. The guardian families, if they still exist as an organized presence, maintain their silence. But the traditions persist. Rules passed down through generations about where to go and where to avoid. About signs that indicate danger. About the sound of singing in empty forests. about clearings that appear where no clearing should exist, about the feeling of being watched by something that sees you more clearly than you see yourself. And every 20 to 30 years, in dozens of locations throughout the mountains, people disappear. The pattern continues. The cycle perpetuates. The thresholds feed and grow and generate new instances of themselves. The colonization proceeds, methodical and patient, spreading through geography and time at a pace that ensures it will never trigger the kind of coordinated response that might stop it. Because that's the genius of it. The phenomenon is distributed, isolated, small-scale enough in each individual instance that it never rises to the level of institutional alarm. A few missing hikers here, a couple of hunters there, isolated incidents separated by years and miles, each explainable on its own terms as simple misadventure. The pattern is only visible when you aggregate the data, when you look at the whole picture across centuries and continents. And anyone who starts looking at that whole picture, anyone who begins to see the pattern clearly enough to sound a genuine alarm, tends to die before they can make their case public. There are people who know. Small groups, distributed networks, individuals who've connected the dots and understand what's happening. They share information carefully, communicate through encrypted channels, maintain the database that tracks threshold locations. They try to warn people away from the most active sites. They monitor the cycles, predict when feedings are likely to occur, attempt to prevent naive hikers from becoming the next Sarah Cunningham, but they're fighting against human nature. Against curiosity and skepticism and the fundamental inability of people to believe in threats they haven't personally experienced. Every warning becomes an invitation. Every story of danger makes the forbidden place more attractive. The documentary culture of modern media has made it worse. People seek out the locations specifically because they're associated with disappearances, because investigating mysteries and exploring dangerous places generates content and views and social validation. How many TikTok videos are there now of teenagers visiting Cold Hollow? How many YouTube channels have made episodes about Appalachian missing persons? How many podcasters have discussed the strange patterns of mountain disappearances, framing them as mysteries to be solved rather than dangers to be avoided? Each video, each podcast, each documentary sends more people into the mountains looking for answers, and the thresholds are always waiting. The cycle that began with Sarah Cunningham, or perhaps began centuries before her and simply captured her in its mechanism, continues. The mountains are full of places that look safe, that appear on maps as ordinary wilderness, that seem like perfect destinations for adventure and exploration. And some of those places are more than they appear. Some of them are hungry. Some of them are waiting for the next feeding cycle to come around, waiting for curious people to walk through their doors, waiting to add new faces to the collection. You could go there yourself, if you wanted. Cold Hollow is marked on maps now, identified as a geographic feature, accessible via trails that the Forest Service maintains. You could hike there in an afternoon, could stand in the clearing where Sarah Cunningham watched Margaret Preston walk through that doorway, could look for evidence of the structure, of the cairns, of the trees with carved faces. You probably wouldn't find anything. Most people don't. They hike through, take their photos, return safely, and dismiss the whole story as legend and exaggeration. The threshold isn't always active. The cycle has its timing. And it can be patient, so remarkably patient, waiting for exactly the right moment, exactly the right combination of circumstances and visitors. But sometimes people do find something. Sometimes they see the structure that shouldn't be there. Sometimes they hear the singing. Sometimes they notice that the person they're hiking with has started moving differently, speaking differently, looking at them with eyes that are just slightly wrong. And sometimes those people come back down the mountain alone, carrying stories they know no one will believe, marked by experiences they can never fully explain. If you go into those mountains, if you visit Cold Hollow or any of the 300 other threshold locations that have been identified, you might encounter nothing unusual at all. The odds are in your favor. Most people who visit these places return safely, unharmed, unaware that they've walked through geography that has consumed dozens of people over the centuries. But you might also encounter something else, something that's been waiting. Something that recognizes in you the next voice it needs, the next face it wants to add to its collection. Something that will smile at you with a face that used to belong to someone else, that will speak to you in words that were stolen from a woman who died screaming in a ravine in 1876. And if that happens, if you find yourself in a clearing that doesn't appear on any map, standing before a doorway that opens into darkness deeper than absence of light, hearing voices sing in harmonies that predate human language, you'll understand what Sarah Cunningham understood. That some places in this world are thresholds. That some hungers are patient enough to wait centuries. That some things that appear human are empty inside, hollow, filled with nothing but the accumulated echoes of everyone they've consumed. That you can run, you can survive, you can come back down the mountain and try to tell your story. But you'll carry a piece of it with you, forever, a mark, a connection, a thread that links you back to that place, that pulls at you in dreams, that whispers to you in the silence between heartbeats. And eventually, if the thread pulls hard enough, if the cycle comes around again, if the threshold needs one more voice to complete its collection, you'll find yourself walking back up that trail. Not because you want to, not because you decided to, but because some part of you never really left, because you've been hollow since the moment you looked through that doorway. Because the thing that came down the mountain wearing your face and speaking with your voice and living your life wasn't entirely you. It was never entirely you again. Sarah Cunningham understood this. That's why she spent those 8 months trying to warn people, trying to document what she'd experienced, trying to build a case that would keep others away from Cold Hollow. Because she knew. She'd felt the pull. She'd recognized that part of her was still on that mountain, trapped in that structure, held in whatever place exists on the other side of the threshold. And she knew that eventually she would have to go back. Maybe she did go back. Maybe the body found at the base of that cliff wasn't hers at all, was someone else, was a deliberate misdirection by people who wanted Sarah's story buried. Maybe she walked up that trail in July 1877, walked into that clearing, walked through that doorway of her own volition, because the thread pulled too hard to resist. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she escaped. Maybe the woman in that photograph from January 1878 really was Sarah, alive 6 months after her supposed death, standing outside a courthouse in the middle of the day, wearing the necklace she'd been found clutching. Maybe she survived. Maybe she's still out there somewhere, changed, marked, no longer entirely human but not entirely hollow either. Something in between. Something that watches the mountains and tracks the cycles and tries, in whatever way she still can, to warn people away. The mountains don't answer these questions. They keep their secrets. They've been keeping secrets since before humans learned to ask questions, and they'll keep them long after we're gone. The thresholds will continue their cycles. The patterns will persist. The disappearances will happen, regular and distributed, small scale enough to avoid systemic alarm, but consistent enough to feed whatever it is that dwells in those thin places where reality becomes permeable. And occasionally someone will find fragments of Sarah's story. We'll read about 3 women who went hiking in 1876. We'll see the photograph of a woman who should have been dead. We'll start asking questions about what really happened on Cold Hollow Mountain. We'll begin to trace the patterns, connect the incidents, build the case that Sarah tried to build. And those people, the ones who look too deeply, who ask too many questions, who start to understand what's really happening in those mountains, they face Sarah's choice. Stop investigating and maybe survive, or continue and become part of the story themselves, another name in the database, another mysterious disappearance, another voice added to the collection. 17 researchers have already made that choice. Hundreds of hikers and hunters have made it unknowingly. Sarah Cunningham made it in November 1876 when she followed Margaret Preston up that trail. The choice is always the same. To go into the mountains or stay away, to investigate the mystery or leave it unsolved, to warn others or maintain silence, to believe that the rules of reality are absolute and unchanging, or accept that there are places where those rules don't quite apply, where something old and patient and hollow waits for the next feeding cycle, where the boundary between worlds is thin enough to cross, where people go in and sometimes come back but never quite return. Cold Hollow is still there. The structure and the clearing, if it exists, is still there. The threshold, dormant or active, is still there. The thing that took Margaret Preston and Emily Sutton, the thing that marked Sarah Cunningham and marked everyone who's encountered it since, is still there, waiting, always waiting, patient as mountains, hungry as time, hollow as the spaces between stars. And it knows your name now, because you've read this story, because you know about Cold Hollow, because curiosity is a thread that connects you to every threshold, every thin place, every clearing where darkness waits behind open doors. The pattern continues. The cycle perpetuates. The mountains keep their secrets and their hunger. And somewhere in the Appalachian wilderness, in one of 300 identified locations, or in places not yet discovered, a threshold is preparing for its next feeding. The cycle has come around again. The signs are appearing. The clearing will manifest. The door will open. And someone, curious and convinced they're safe, will walk through it. Maybe it will be you.